Welcome to Blessed Man Meditations. My name is Andy. On this YouTube channel, I offer thoughtful responses to skeptical objections to the Christian faith. I likewise edify the saints by equipping them to provide an answer for the hope that lies within them. I hope that you find value in my work. Please like my videos, send me comments, and please subscribe. Let's work together to contend earnestly for the faith that's been once for all delivered to the saints. Blessed Man Meditations is where we answer the intellectual side of Christianity, equip Christians to defend the hope that is in them. Today on Blessed Man Meditations, we continue looking at the book by Metaxas, Is Atheism Dead? Metaxas is a best-selling author whose books have been translated into 25 languages. He hosts a nationally syndicated radio show and acclaimed conversation series, Socrates in the City. He's a prominent cultural commentator. His works have appeared in the New York Times, the New Yorker, the Atlantic, and the Wall Street Journal. There's a link there to an article that he did for the Wall Street Journal some time ago with the scientific, with some talk about the scientific evidence for the existence of God. In this book, Is Atheism Dead? That article is included, and that is one of the, if not the final installment in this book, and so Lord willing, that'll probably be on this channel. So today we continue part 3, What is Truth? And chapter 24 is the topic for today, the impossible bleakness of materialism. There can be discovered no more lamentable illustration of the misunderstanding about faith and science than in the writings of Richard Dawkins. The noted atheist Richard Dawkins has some very grave misconceptions about faith and the relationship between faith and science. Dawkins himself is a scientist, but unlike scientists who understand their discipline, Dawkins is also a materialist who believes there can be nothing beyond matter and believes that science alone can give us knowledge. We agree that doing science is scientific, but to unscientifically insist nothing can be known apart from science is to move into scientistic philosophy, which must also mean abandoning logic. It is impossible that science is the only discipline that can give us knowledge. It is impossible. So much could be said. Mathematics, I would not equate that with science necessarily. Much that we can learn about history is not scientific. In fact, history is an essential discipline when it comes to this topic, and we've run into that in multiple previous chapters in this book, Is Atheism Dead?, where we looked at the evidence for the historicity of the New Testament, for the evidence for some of the historicity of the Old Testament, when we looked at the archaeological finds. That's not science, that's history, that's archaeology, or at least not science in the way that Dawkins would claim science is. So, but this is the strange devil's bargain Dawkins and some other academics have been willing to make, if only for the thin pottage that is the fleeing admiration of undergraduates. People who want to abandon moral restraint, who want to abdicate moral responsibility, will trick themselves, like Dawkins and many others have, into believing that there is no God. And to do so requires, as Metaxas has said, intellectual dishonesty and rejection of clear evidence and clear implications. But they do it because their consciences are seared as with a hot iron. They do it because, as Hitchens would have said, they don't want someone telling them basically what they can and can't do. And if you can eliminate the idea of God, then you can do as you please, as long as you can avoid contact with the civil authorities. Dawkins delights, for example, in bringing up the case of Archbishop James Ussher, a 17th century divine who dated the beginning of the universe to the evening of October 22nd in the year 4004 BC. Any serious Christian today finds this ridiculous and, of course, dismisses it for any number of reasons. Yet, Mr. Dawkins solemnly beats the drum that accepting Ussher's fanciful conclusion is typical of people of faith today. This is what you call straw manning. The new atheist will typically do that with people of religion. They will take an argument that most people would find disagreement with, and they will beat up that argument that people already disagree with. And so they're not even trying to argue the same point that the religious person is arguing. But if they can do it bombastically and with great pomp and emotional appeal to their audience, then they can manipulate them into thinking that they're right. And Metaxas will explain in later on in this book how they do that, and it's pretty infuriating, and it's pretty right on, actually. He must assume no one will catch him in this. So Dawkins beats the drum of Ussher's fanciful conclusion that is typical of people of faith today, and Dawkins assumes that no one will catch him strawmanning the Christian position, so he peacocks ahead proudly, spreading his shimmering fan as often as possible. It is today unavoidably comical that Archbishop Ussher made his assertion, but for some context about the world in which the Archbishop calculated, we may remind ourselves that he entered this world in the year 1581, when Sir Francis Drake was knighted by Elizabeth I for circumnavigating the globe. Shakespeare was a teenager. But Dawkins seems to have no ethical problem with performing the calisthenics of reaching backward to the age of exploration for evidence of how backward faith is. Sure, I can pick the worst possible example of a scientific experiment, show that it didn't work, and say, look, science doesn't work. Science is terrible because of this poor example. Science. Well, that's what that's the parallel that Metaxas is making here, that Dawkins has picked a poor example, and he's lumping everyone in with that poor example, and that's intellectually dishonest. It's disingenuous, and that's what the new atheists do to get people to believe their propaganda, to believe their lies, and it's very, very sad. Dawkins even says Ussher thundered his pronouncement with the immense authority of the church, never telling us which church, since there were many at that time, nor disclosing that most human beings in Christendom have never heard of Archbishop Ussher, even during his lifetime. In such assertions, Dawkins has impressively clambered well beyond the tree line where oxygen becomes scarce. For further context, we might point out that Johannes Kepler, one of the key figures in the scientific revolution, and typically held up as a paragon of science, only disagreed with Ussher's chronology by 12 years, putting it at 3992 BC. So obviously, believing what the Bible says, and even thinking we can use it to determine the age of the universe, which we cannot, is not an issue of faith versus science, else Kepler would not have taken it seriously. Kepler wasn't the only undisputed scientific genius who weighed in on Ussher's date. Isaac Newton also took a mathematical whack at the puzzle of the age of the universe and settled on 4000 BC, just 4 years off Ussher's mark. So whatever Dawkins is trying to say in referencing Ussher is such an inconsistent mess that we're obliged to look away. It appears Dawkins is interested principally in raising his followers' peak against their perceived enemies, and confidently asserts what he likes as though disclaiming ex cathedra to the birds and bees from a stump in a sylvan grove. We must not be so rude as to chirrup at him without facts and logic. In his 2000 essay titled The Hubris of Religion, which means to be a full-throated peon to science, Dawkins whips up an intoxicating paella of self-contradiction, ultimately too confusing to digest. But at one juncture, Dawkins coughs up the entirety of his thinking with the impressive succinctness of an owl pellet. Dawkins says, quote, "Pride can be justified, and science does so in spades. So does Beethoven, so does Shakespeare, Michelangelo, Christopher Wren, so do the engineers who built the giant telescopes in Hawaii and in the Canary Islands, the giant radio telescopes and very large arrays that stare sightless into the southern sky, or the Hubble orbiting telescope and the spacecraft that launched it. The engineering feats deep underground at CERN, CERN, combining monumental size with minutely accurate tolerances of measurement, literally moved me to tears when I was shown around. The engineering, mathematics, physics, and the Rosetta mission that successfully soft-landed a robot vehicle on the tiny target of a comet also made me proud to be a human," end quote. What on earth is he being moved to tears about? I mean, it sounds like a reaction of awe about something. A worshiper in the true God would describe moments when they've been moved to awe or worship, which this description sounds like Dawkins is almost worshiping these created things. And a Christian would say he should be worshiping the one true God. And Dawkins' mannerisms here almost mimic that of an act of worship. It's interesting. For anyone unaware of what Dawkins has said elsewhere and what he will say later in the same essay, there would be nothing wrong with these sentiments, but when one reads the paragraph not as he hopes, but as his own materialist philosophy insists, one discovers that, like the proverbial snake swallowing its own tail, it devours itself out of existence until we stand agog, wondering how he has performed its extraordinary trick. The first problem arrives in his admiration of the non-scientists in his second sentence. Can the arch-materialist mean to sneak in an appreciation for beauty without our noticing that he's done so? He evidently believes praising humans for their accomplishments somehow puts them against the God he claims does not exist. Yeah, that's kind of what I was finding odd on the previous slide. It almost sounded like he was using words that are worshipful in their tone, and Metaxas recognizes that too. This appreciation for beauty almost has a worshipful shape to it. But again, going by the standard Dawkins and the New Atheists insist on, how does he think it is permissible to praise Beethoven, Shakespeare, Michelangelo, and Wren as those in whom we can take pride? What's the point? I mean, why are we praising them? They're just humans like Dawkins is, like you are, like I am. The praise that Dawkins is showering them with seems to be best reserved for God alone. Anyone with feeling does and should admire them, and we're glad to think Mr. Dawkins does too, but how can it be that he does so when in his angry pronouncements he has said anything that is not scientific, or that is somehow beyond the material, is nonsense? To any strict materialist and atheist, all music and art and architecture simply do not fit anywhere any more than do necromancy and astral projection. Right. They're not material. They're not materialist in the strictest sense. Those things, especially music, and so it's how can you find beauty in those things? I mean, I've heard apologists argue for God's existence from the starting point of beauty. How can you have beauty and how can it be appreciated apart from the knowledge of the existence of God? Most of us know that beauty is transcendent. Okay, the beauty of music, art, architecture. Most of us know the beauty of music, art, and architecture is transcendent and speaks to our souls, but a strict materialist believes neither in transcendent beauty nor in anything else transcendent. So then how do they get off using words that sound like they're talking about something transcendent? He certainly has no patience for the idea of a soul. To him, music is merely sound waves and certain frequencies detectable to our ears, which have evolved randomly over the eons to hear these frequencies. Right. How can you appreciate something beautiful, something awesome, if it's purely, if you break it down to its purely materialistic elements, like Dawkins would have us do? It makes no sense to do that. But in praising Beethoven's music, Dawkins' wagon has clattered dramatically from the far ruts of his secularist philosophy, and although we're certainly glad to see it, we desperately wish he might see it too and explain how he squares this particular circle. Yes, how can he find this beauty, this stuff to appreciate in his materialistic worldview? It seems inconsistent. Dawkins must know praising the moving beauty of music is not far from talking about other immaterial things like God, yet he doesn't seem to make the connection or doesn't seem to wish to make the connection. Yes, how can, I mean, music is by and large immaterial, and he's going to find beauty in that immaterial thing, but yet he's going to deny immaterial things the way the materialists do. It seems inconsistent for him to find that beauty in those immaterial things. Can he tell us how rationality and science come into the picture where Beethoven is concerned? Can he explain why such music might move anyone? One would expect him to say that all of it is nonsense, that blind evolutionary processes have unwittingly bumped us along through the ages to a point where for no particular reason we find certain things beautiful, sometimes so much that our eyes grow moist. How does evolution account for that? How does evolution account for the appreciation of? But can he tell us why he himself should be moved by these four geniuses and their art? Is he moved because all these figures are European white men with whom he finds a primeval and tribal affinity? Or does he mean to suggest that there's something objective about what he considers beautiful? According to his own severe parameters, he has, alas, galloped heedlessly into a tar pit, and is descending slowly but surely fossilward. He must realize beauty and being moved to tears can have no part in a life dedicated to a strict materialist atheistic philosophy. And surely he must know that many in England despise St. Paul's and much else that Christopher Wren created precisely because Wren did what he did to glorify the God in whom Dawkins pretends not to believe and whose devotees he curses with such florid expressions of contempt. It appears Dawkins wishes to have it both ways, despite the logical contradiction. In mentioning Beethoven, Shakespeare, Michelangelo, and Wren, Dawkins seems to hope some of their cultural and intellectual bona fides might rub off on him, perhaps so that he doesn't come across as a materialist curmudgeon. But isn't it too late for this? Dawkins and Hitches have been so wildly opposed to anything touching on God or the eternal, and so brutally dogmatic in their pronouncements that the material world is all there is, that to find them praising art or artists is strange and almost reckless, like the thief who almost wishes to be caught and leaves more clues than he should. Or perhaps the whole thing is a deliberate misdirection intended to throw people off the depressing atheist trail, as if to say, we're not Philistines. We can be atheists who appreciate great music and great art. But on what basis? They've sprinted Wile E. Coyote-like off a cliff, and as they say these things, they're absurdly pontificating mid-air. The uncompromising laws of science know nothing of grace and are already pulling at their legs from anyone below. Do they not understand that science can only tell them at what speed they will encounter the unyielding planet whose tremendous mass unkindly sucks them toward itself? In choosing his four examples, it almost seems as though Dawkins wised to undermine his own position. Beethoven composed some of his greatest church music in history, and his Mises Solemnis, Latin for solemn mass, is among his greatest achievements. My chief aim, Beethoven said of it, was to awaken and permanently instill religious feelings not only into the singers but also into the listeners. 20 years before, when Beethoven was unable to marry the woman he loved, he dedicated his song Moonlight Sonata to her and wrote, "I must live by myself alone. But I know well that God is nearer to me than others in my art, so I will fearlessly walk with him." But what can such a vile religionist possibly have to say to such as Dawkins? And I believe the reference to a vile religionist is tongue-in-cheek from Metaxas with reference to Beethoven. Couldn't he rather, at least, have praised the irksome clatter of Arnold Schoenberg or John Cage? We must similarly wonder how he believes he can praise Michelangelo, who probably more than any artist of any age expressed the power of Christian faith and himself evinced it most seriously. His painting of the Sistine Chapel ceiling, among the most religious expressions of any artist, is widely considered among the greatest masterpieces in history, and is said to have changed the very course of Western art. On beholding it, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe declared, quote, "Without having seen the Sistine Chapel, one can form no appreciable idea of what one man is capable of achieving." And Michelangelo's Pieta in cold marble depicting Mary holding the body of her murdered son is among the most beautiful and moving works ever created. Couldn't Dawkins have praised the hostile horrors of Mark Rothko or Robert Motherwell? There's Michelangelo's Pieta that was referred to on the previous slide. Here's paintings by Mark Rothko, referred to on the previous slide. Is that Rothko also? Might see. Maybe that's Robert Motherwell. Maybe. I didn't put his name on there. Could be. Of the four artists, only Shakespeare is not known, especially for his connection to religion, although he is far from secular. But like the other two, Sir Christopher Wren is most famous for his work related to God, for he designed and built the masterpiece of St. Paul's Cathedral in London following the Great Fire of 1666. He was also commissioned to design a further 51 churches destroyed in the terrible conflagration, so that his fame rests almost exclusively on his services toward the establishment church, which, according to Dawkins and his gang of gosh gauchos, is the festering nidus of all foulness on our coincidentally inhabitable planet. Christopher Wren did some famous work for the church, and because of his worldview, people like Richard Dawkins won't allow themselves to appreciate it because of the religious undertones in it. According to Dawkins' own system of thinking, he has no right or reason to take pride in these great artists. One may wonder whether he really is the strict materialist atheist he claims. Perhaps he's softened to the point of common sense, but then one crashes into something so adamantine on this point that any happy hopes are atomized. In praising science, Dawkins says, quote, "Religion, by embarrassing contrast to science, has contributed literally zero to what we know, combined with huge hubristic confidence in the alleged facts it is simply made up," end quote. That's just somebody who, these people are just so ignorant of the facts of history, of science and the history of science, that they don't know what they're talking about. They bury their head in the sand. They refuse to acknowledge facts. And they do it to their own detriment, but what's most sad is they leave the majority, it seems, astray with them. Jesus said that the way is narrow that leads to life and few find it. Not that the majority are atheists, but definitely the majority are not Christian, at least according to what Jesus said. People like Dawkins and his minions just leading people astray. I hope that people can get a hold of works like this by Metaxas and get woken up to the truth that they're missing. Before we respond more fully, we're obliged to at least ask, does there exist a sillier sentence in any language that religion has contributed zero to what we know? Perhaps it's merely a case of unwitting jappery. But alas, the only conclusion to be drawn is that Mr. Dawkins really has no idea that within the confined space of a single essay, he has asserted claims that are existential enemies and are holding cocked pistols to each other's temples. Nonetheless, it's a confounding puzzlement. Can this man, who is a fellow of the Royal Society, really be unaware that he has leaned so far out over his skis that he's begun somersaulting? One may also earnestly wonder if the sentence about religion contributing literally zero to what we know was missed by everyone in the various drafts of the editing process. Yeah, I mean, why wouldn't somebody give that back to him and say, Richard, really? Dawkins, really? Are you serious? Or perhaps none of the venerable author's editors had the courage to bring it up. Yeah, that sounds more likely. Of course, Dawkins has said as much elsewhere, so does it appear he thinks it's logical that all quote-unquote knowledge comes to us via scientific inquiry and that apart from science there is no knowledge? That's ludicrous, that science is the only source for knowledge. That is just ridiculous. And somebody like John Lennox would say, he is a scientist, he's a mathematician, he is a scientist, but other people, Jim Tor, that we've talked about in this on this channel, that Metaxas talked about in this book. Stephen Meyer, others. These scientists, these Christians who do science, they have shown repeatedly that you can. I mean, it's Lennox who says that it is the belief in God that allows one to do science. In fact, I think in later chapters in this book, we're going to talk more about the history of science and how it is Christians that were responsible for the scientific revolution. And you don't hear the new atheist people like Dawkins mentioning that they wouldn't even be able to do what they're doing if it wasn't for the Christian foundation that was laid for them, that they're trampling underfoot. But God's word will not return void. God will put his enemies under his feet. So it's my prayer that Dawkins and those who follow his teachings and those who share his views, that before they end up under God's feet, crushed in the fierceness of the winepress of the wrath of God, that they would humble themselves, repent, believe the gospel, and taste and see that the Lord is good, and be recipients of God's rich mercy. That's what I hope to see from videos like this and others on my. I have to just receive angry comments from atheists. I'd like to see some humility and some repentance and some genuine faith born out of it. I'm not trying to win an argument. I want to see some changed lives. Dawkins has said that religion has contributed literally zero to what we know. Does Dawkins think that apart from science there is no knowledge? It almost sounds like that's what he thinks, but I think we said here that that's ridiculous. What Dawkins doesn't seem to know is that this belief is itself a matter of faith and not science. Yes, Dawkins' statement is a statement of unabashed faith, an inordinate amount of faith, a rational faith in science, the discipline of science. It is a statement of faith. It is not a scientific statement. Say that that religion's contributed literally zero to what we know. That's not a statement of science. That's a statement of faith. That's not a statement of science. It's a statement of faith. Or that it takes infinitely less faith to believe in the resurrection, which is at least theoretically possible. But Dawkins does believe that science is the source of all knowledge and that religion's contributed nothing to what we know. And with the sort of frightened and blind faith that spooks at the approaching sound of evidence and logic. Yes, when you present he and his minions with evidence for theism in Christianity, and the logic that undergirds it, they shirk at that. They can't deal with the theistic implications, so they bury their heads in it. Yet this perfectly irrational conviction is at the lifeless heart of the strange and unappealing doctrine called atheist materialism. What view of the world could be more asphyxiating? Perhaps it was in somehow sensing that he felt the wild instinct to doff his cap to the four great artists mentioned, assuming his readers would miss the contradiction as he seems to have done. The only way to make sense of what Dawkins is saying is to assume he honestly cannot see the percussive incongruity at play. On the one hand, he says we're essentially robots, amazingly constructed by chance through natural selection. On the other hand, we're able to create and appreciate things of ineffable beauty and mystery. But if scientific knowledge is the only kind of knowledge, how are we to appreciate the aforementioned artists? What is art that Dawkins should be mindful of it? And the creators of that art that he should praise them? That's a play on words on a scripture passage, if I'm not mistaken. And what is Socrates' much vaunted ideal of self-knowledge but unscientific fluff born to us by Zephyrus from the myth-filled world of pagan antiquity? And what is that invisible thing called wisdom, hailed by the millennia of human beings, if not a mere hardware glitch, yet to be naturally selected by some genetic mangle for death? So, yes, wisdom and self-knowledge, those are not material things. Knowledge is not a material thing. So, I mean, goodness, to have knowledge, knowledge itself is not material. The things about which we have knowledge, some of them are material, sure, but knowledge itself is not material. Shall not such things be reckoned worthless and disposable because they dare exist beyond the gleaming palisades of science? Sure, they exist beyond science because they're not material. If science is materialist, like Dawkins defines science. If we're to take Dawkins' word, we must eventually put him to the uncomfortable question about where he gets the idea that murdering and raping are in any way bad and generally to be eschewed. Right, yes, here's Metaxas making the point that the moral argument for God's existence that we went over when we did I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist by Frank Turek and Norm Geisler. That was the chapter that was called Mother Teresa versus Hitler. On a theistic worldview, we know there must be absolute right and wrong, and we can define it more clearly than let me make sure I said that right. On a worldview that believes in the existence of God, the theistic worldview, we have a way to ground objective morality that the materialist atheist does not have. The materialist atheist can be moral, and they can say they believe in objective morality, but they have no way to ground it. And there will be people who will disagree with that, but they try to explain how they ground their morality. It will become apparent that there's no clear, discernible way for them to ground it. There's no way to do it. heard many try, and it doesn't make sense. But then they'll say, well, how can you ground morality in the existence of a God who advocates the things like the things that Paul Copan addresses in his book that I'm going through on this channel, Is God a Moral Monster? All those Old Testament passages that seem to endorse slavery, that seem to endorse genocide, that seem to endorse all these negative things that make God look like a quote-unquote moral monster, those are emotional reactions created against they're emotional strawman reactions that have been created to engender fear and rage, but it's not based on a proper understanding of the text. And Paul Copan goes to great lengths to correct the atheistic misconceptions. So check out those videos on this channel. Is God a Moral Monster by Paul Copan. There's a whole playlist. Eventually there will be 20 videos on that series. So, if we're to take Dawkins at his word, we must put the uncomfortable question about where he gets the idea that murdering and raping are bad and generally to be eschewed. Yes, on an atheistic worldview, you can't say that those things are wrong, or if you do, you can't really back it up. On a theistic worldview, a Christian worldview, you can say that it's wrong to rape and murder because the person that's raping and murdering is created in God's image. It is from scientific experimentations with falsifiable is it from scientific experimentations with falsifiable hypotheses that he knows that murdering and raping is bad? What are the experiments that determine that raping and murdering are bad? And why hasn't someone shared the experiments that showed murdering and raping are wrong with the world? Or can we all guess that he and his ideological comrades know these activities are in fact not bad at all, but dare not say so for fear of unpleasant backlash? I mean, if he's going to be consistent, he can't really say that these things are bad. But he knows better than to do that. But isn't it true that according to these doctrines, murder and rape are merely activities resulting from the evolutionary process that knows nothing of good or evil, and there cannot be and therefore cannot be condemned? Pray, won't you tell us? Again, Dawkins and the other glum horsemen cannot have these things both ways, so they must cleverly change horses midstream to suit their argument, hoping those invested in what they're saying won't notice who's on which mount when, or at least won't say anything if they do notice, since it's all in good cause. Not that there's anything intrinsically or objectively morally good, but perhaps no one will bring that up either. Yeah, Metaxas is showing the insanity of this atheistic position, because reminds me of what Turek and Geisler called the Roadrunner tactic, and that Metaxas is flipping Dawkins' argument around and putting it back on him, showing the absurdity of it, and that's essentially what the Roadrunner tactic does. Still, it's remarkable. In one moment, the materialist curmudgeon praises the poetry of Shakespeare and the wordless beauty of the creations of Michelangelo, Beethoven, and Wren, and in the next, he moralistically denounces anything undiscoverable by science as a wicked stepchild who should be sent into the woods and eaten by wolves. Right, so he can't discover beauty from Michelangelo, Beethoven, and Wren from the scientific method. He can't. It's not possible. But then he's going to moralistically denounce anything that's not discoverable by science as the wicked stepchild. It's hypocritical. I can't think of a better word than hypocritical. It is disingenuous. Maybe he doesn't see it. Let's give him the benefit of the doubt. Maybe he doesn't see it. Maybe he's not intentionally trying to be duplicitous. Maybe he's just not seeing it. Surely he knows no computer will ever understand why the Sistine Chapel or St. Paul's Cathedral are unutterably glorious, because to understand that one requires something that cannot be concatenated via natural processes, for it partakes of glory itself. Does Mr. Dawkins not see that such beauty as he has praised points inevitably to things that as far beyond science as the nebulae are beyond the lightning isle at Costco? Huh. There is no lightning isle at Costco. So you're not going to find the nebulae at Costco. And what shall we make of his tears at the monstrous particle accelerator beneath the Franco-Swiss border, except that Dawkins himself is the creation of a being who is glorified by these things that peer into the heart of his impossibly great creation? Mr. Dawkins never realized that according to his scientific theories, tears and the emotion one feels at anything are just a mysterious quirk of evolution, no different than the unfortunate webbing between some people's toes? Perhaps at some point in our prehistoric past, when we were sprinting for our lives across the African savannah, some of these things had a purpose, or when we were climbing as fish with nubby legs from the water toward our brave terrestrial futures. But does he not realize that according to his philosophy, his feelings are just leftovers from some time when they helped, which now they do not? Does he not know that their phantom limbs still aching and twinging, though they are not there at all? We're happy to think Dawkins and his equine confreres appreciate things outside science, but how much better would it be if they dared to appreciate the untenable contradiction in their position and made some honest effort to address it? Right. What a great argument by Metaxas. Just buy his book, read it slowly, chew on it, meditate on it, think about it. Atheism's untenable. Sorry. If you are listening to this because you want to mock me or other people who believe in God out of the Bible, or Christian, just ask the God you don't believe in to break your heart. That's what's going to need to happen. You to humble yourself, repent, and believe the God. So, thank you for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Please tune in for the next installment, which will be the founding myth of atheism, Galileo, Copernicus, and the Church. And I hope you have a blessed rest of your day.